Good morning everyone and welcome to our webinar on abandoned, neglected and detrimental land legislation. A little bit of housekeeping to start off. As a reminder to all attendees and staff, this session is being recorded. We've also got something exciting coming up in a couple of weeks. We've got Community Land Week, which is running from 11th till 19th of August. You can look it up on the Community Land Scotland website for events all over Scotland celebrating community land ownership. Speaking today, we've got Dave Thompson, who is the head of the Community Land team at the Scottish Government, and Gemma Campbell, who's a Senior Development Manager here at High in the Community Assets team. If you've got any questions at any point during this, please just pop them in the question box on your right-hand side of your screen and we'll get them to them in the Q&A session at the end. The whole session today will be about an hour and we're going to kick off with Dave Thompson.
Morning everybody.
Here we go, Dave, and I'll just mute myself and you can kick off.
Okay, good morning everyone. I'd like to just start by giving you a very brief idea of the area of work I'm involved in. There's basically these three broad areas of policy. Obviously are all related. So we've got policy and operational lead on community right to buy, that's all of the rights. Also responsibility for our government target of 1 million acre community land ownership by 2020 and for the oversight of the Scottish Land Fund. Now these three areas all obviously very much related but not necessarily interdependent on each other. So for example, sometimes a common misconception is that you must be going through the community right to buy to be able to access the land fund and vice versa. That's not the case. But today's session is going to be on the new right to buy, which is the right to buy land which is abandoned, neglected or detrimental, or Part 3A as we call it. In this right to buy land we mean buildings and other structures on the land, inland waters, canals and the foreshore, so it's a fairly wide selection. It's similar to the existing community right to buy, which is Part 2, so we've kept the types of organisations that can apply the same. So that's the company limited the guarantee, Scottish charitable and corporate organisation or community benefit company. Obviously the main difference between Part 3A and Part 2 is that Part 3A is a compulsory purchase right. So in other words, if the application is approved by Scottish ministers, the owner must sell to the community group. The price that is then paid is market value, which is determined by a district valuer who is appointed by the Scottish Government. So one thing to say right up front, it's not a way to get something at a knockdown price. Now one thing to say about this particular right to buy is that it is never meant to be the first step a group should take in trying to address land in this condition. They should have exhausted other means before resorting to the compulsory purchase right. So with that in mind, we have a few things that a community group must have already done before we can accept an application, aside from forming the compliant companies as noted above. First of all, they must have already tried to buy the land. Now what we mean by this will differ between applications. It doesn't necessarily mean offering whatever an owner or community group for that matter think that the land is worth. So for example, given the likely condition this sort of land is going to be in, it could well be substantial post-acquisition costs and they might merit a lower offer. However, to be fair, offering £1 is unlikely to count as an attempt to buy. Equally, if a group are trying to get in touch with an owner several times and they've been completely ignored, and of course the proof of these attempts to get in touch, then that could also count as trying to buy without having actually made an offer. So on that basis, I would encourage any owners that have been contacted by a group not to completely ignore these efforts at communication. So that's the first main issue that the groups have to keep in mind, is they must have already tried to buy that land. It should also never be seen as a way to delay or block development or a further sale on of land. So if an owner has offered the land to a group already and they chose not to accept that offer, then if they decide, for example, maybe once development plans are better known that they now actually want to buy the land after all, they cannot use the Act to do so within 12 months of that previous offer. Of course, if there were good reasons for not accepting that offer at the time, for example, maybe there were very restrictive conditions placed on the offer, or the value was well in excess of market value, they could put forward those as good reasons for not having accepted the offer, and that will still allow them to use the right to buy. So although they may have been offered it, if there were good reasons for not accepting that offer, they can state those reasons, and if we accept those, then they won't be allowed that application. The Act itself states that the land must be abandoned, neglected, or detrimental. To get that last condition, its full title is where the land, the use or management of the land is such that it results in or causes harm directly or indirectly to the environmental well-being of a relevant community. Not exactly a snappy title, which is why we start with detrimental in the title of the Act itself. Now, if a community group's application is based on this third element, the detrimental element, one of the other things they must have tried before putting the application is contacting a relevant regulator to fix the issue. Again, down to the fact that the compulsory purchase should never be the first step. So basically you've identified there is something that's causing harm to your community, your environmental well-being of your community, and you've attempted to have that harm fixed by the relevant regulator. Now, by relevant regulator, we mean a regulator who has statutory powers to deal with either the harm itself or the use that's causing that harm. Again, the group will provide evidence that they have done this. It may be that there's a perfectly good reason why the regulator cannot or will not fix the issue. Just because they don't do anything doesn't mean to say the application can't be allowed, but the group must show that they have contacted that regulator to try and fix that issue. The application itself is broadly similar to the existing Part 2 application. For example, the group still needs to show their plans for the land, indicate the level of community support, provide an outline business case. Essentially, it shows that the group is capable, should they be given this right to buy, of delivering a viable project on the land that they wish to buy. There are some specific elements to be aware of for a Part 2 application. Now, this requirement here is about why the plans are in the public interest, compatible with furthering sustainable development. It's the same as Part 2. However, what to keep in mind is that obviously the public interest test, for example, will need to take into account this is a compulsory purchase. So the group's reasons and the test that we then apply to that, those reasons must be robust because this is a compulsory purchase, so the public interest test is that little bit higher in that respect. Unlike a Part 2 application where the first demonstration to us or community supported by means of the likes of a petition, because this is a compulsory purchase, if the application is approved, the group would then move straight into buying the land. So what we ask is that they need to demonstrate the community is in favour when they apply, and this is done by means of formal postal ballot, which essentially means that the whole community gets a chance to have a say-so, as opposed to a petition where obviously those who you just have to run across or asked to sign a petition will state their preferences, the balance of the whole community. Now, because it comes in at the time of the application, the group themselves will need to meet the cost of this at the time. However, they can claim relevant costs back from the Scottish Government once they submit that application. Now, relevant costs mean those associated with the running of the ballot, so things like the postage, the stationery, the printing, etc. It doesn't mean the big party that you hold in the, in the local community centre or wherever to promote the ballot itself. So it's relevant costs associated with running the ballot itself. So aside from contacting the relevant regulator, if they rely on the detrimental, they've obviously got to show that what they plan to do with the land will essentially fix the problem. So in other words, that their plans will remove or at least substantially remove that harm, rather than just we'll buy the land and we'll think about how we're going to fix the issue later on. So you've got to demonstrate that up front. Now, the community land team will always work with groups to ensure their application is what we refer to as compliant. In other words, there's no sections left blank, all the relevant paperwork's there, etc. Now at that stage, the group submit their formal application to Scottish ministers. At the same time, they have to send a complete copy to the owner, as well as any creditors with standard securities on the land. Now when we receive that full application, the full formal application, we then send the details to the Registers of Scotland, and they'll place an entry on the new register, which is called the Register of Applications by Communities to Buy Land. Essentially, that will hold details of all Part 3 applications and in future applications under Part 5 of the Land Reform Act 2016. And essentially, when an application appears on that register, prohibition is placed on the owner, which prevents them from taking any steps to transfer that land. What that does is allows us to assess the application and make a recommendation to the Cabinet Secretary on whether to approve or reject that application. What I will say is when we do that, we make a recommendation to the CabSec, and I can assure you that the CabSec herself considers these carefully and has been known to differ in her opinion to what we think, so it's not a tick box exercise. She will consider the applications fully, and that's more of a decision based on the evidence that we put up in the recommendation we make. Now, as I said, the group send a copy to the owner. Now, what that does, it gives the owner essentially a chance to comment on the application itself and give us their opinion so that we can make our decision or our recommendation to the CabSec on a balanced set of evidence. At the same time, we will also ask anybody who has land adjacent to that, if they have any opinions, as well as anybody else we think is relevant, but the main person is obviously the owner, and secondly would be any creditors. So, for example, they get a chance to say why they think the group's plans are not in the public interest or further sustainable development. And just like the group themselves, they will have to provide evidence or at least reasons for thinking that. It's not just an opinion. Like the group, we need some evidence to back that up. They also get a chance to say why, if they remain the owner, then that itself would be compatible with further sustainable. Because one of the things the group has to say is why, if that person stayed the owner, the harm would continue or sustainable development wouldn't be met. The owner again gets a chance to essentially come back and say, well, no, it would. And again, back that up with some sort of evidence. At the end of the day, the legislation, the aim of the legislation is about bringing land back into productive use. If that jolts the owner into doing something which does that, then that's perfectly fine by us. But they're unwilling or unable, then this right to buy gives the community group the chance to step in and do something. Again, they're allowed to present counter arguments against the condition of the land, maybe stating why it's in the current condition. It could be biodiversity related, or there could be some restrictions on what they could do, which means that they don't consider it to be abandoned or neglected or detrimental. Again, it may be something community groups are aware of, but so the owner gets their chance to say why that particular situation occurred. Finally, they also get to see what their plans are for the land. Now that's one thing that the community might not be aware of. So we ask the owner to provide us, evidence of what their plans are. With those plans, we'll take various factors into account, including the age of the plans, how detailed they are, whether or not we think they're viable. And that's exactly the same as we do for a group's business plans. An application, and just like groups, to be fair, plans that look like they're written on the back of a fag packet 2 weeks earlier are unlikely to carry much weight in that respect. So it shouldn't be seen as if somebody can quickly draw up a plan that will be enough to foil a right to buy. That's not the case. It needs to show that the owner did have plans for the site, and for whatever reason they either not started to act on those plans or they're only partially acted, but again, look for some sort of evidence from the owner of those plans. over and above just their comment that no, I plan to do something with this. So there is backup there for the owner in those respects, but like a community group, it has to be evidence. And as a catch-all, anything else they consider relevant in that could be anything that the community group's not necessarily aware of that they think is pertinent to that. Once we get those owners' comments back, as well as comments from anybody else that we've asked for, the community group get a chance to respond to those points, either counter the counter or to correct misconceptions or errors, or in some cases to say, oh, we didn't know that was the case, in which case, we'll work with that plan. So that's all perfectly relevant, but they get a chance to respond to that. In terms of timescales, when the applicant, when we ask the owner for the views, they get 60 days in which to give us those views. Once we've got all of the views from everybody, the community group get a further 60 days to respond to those. Once that time period is up, Scottish ministers will then make a decision no earlier than 60 days after that. So from end to end, from getting the application essentially to the ministers making the decision, will be in the region of about 180 days, which is 6 months. But that's quite a long time, but it's a compulsory purchase. There will be a lot of evidence, arguments, opinions put out about whether that should or shouldn't be allowed. So that's why that's quite a long period in which ministers get to make that decision overall and to collect all that evidence. The prohibition will remain in place throughout that period. However, it's one thing that's worth noting is that the owners are entitled to claim compensation for any losses or expenses occurred as a result of complying with the Act. Their stretch is in complying with the Act. So simply hiring somebody to look over a business plan for you is not complying with the Act. However, for example, if you have to pay for an extra 6 months security on the site, if you were about to get rid of it, that could count. All of that would have to be vouched and fully evidenced to us, but there is the opportunity for the owner to claim compensation back on that respect. There are some types of land which are excluded from this right to buy. Basically, any land or building that's somebody's home or land that's associated with that home. Croft land, because that already has a compulsory purchase right to buy under Part 3 of the Act, so there's no real point in giving it another one. Land which is owned by the Crown, that basically is land in which the QLTR has taken ownership or taken possession of. The QLTR is Queen, Lord, Treasurer and Remembrancer. Essentially, they will take responsibility or possession of land which has no owner, truly ownerless as I say, or someone has died with no heirs, and therefore the land falls down in that respect. Now, the reason it's excluded is that the QLTR are not in the business of holding on to land for as long as they can, because their main aim is to sell it on, and the proceeds go back to, I think it's now the Scottish Bloc, to be honest, but it was the Crown. So they're quite willing to sell. On that basis, it's a quicker process for a group to get in touch with QLTR and ask if you can buy it from them instead. And the QLTR themselves have said they're perfectly willing to do that and have done so in the past. So there's secondary legislation which essentially goes into quite a bit of detail, so I can't cover it all here, but what it does is add detail to several areas. I spoke earlier about the ballot reimbursement for community groups. Essentially it's how they go about claiming that and when they're able to do so. It goes into details about what ministers must take into account in relation to the land. So it's physical condition, any designations or classifications, so maybe it's a nature reserve, or there's a triple SI in it, or it's a scheduled monument, or it's in a national planning framework. So anything like that which has a bearing on why the land is in that condition and why there may or may not be restrictions on its use because of that. Also how the land is actually being used or managed, or not, as the case may be, and that's generally lawful use. So just because somebody's decided to use this piece of land as a scramble track for motorbikes against the owner's wishes or even knowledge, that doesn't then count as a valid reason which would stop the right to buy. So there may well be circumstances why it's being used or managed in a particular way that, again, the secondary legislation says we must take into account. And it's also the main bit about what is harm if that detrimental element is taken into account. As it says, it's harm to the environmental well-being of the community, and that's not environmental harm, because that's slightly different, and it's the most subjective element of this right to buy. So essentially it allows a group to make their cases to why they think the use or management of the condition of land is causing harm to the community. The secondary legislation does restrict this to anything that's causing a statutory nuisance or the object of a warning notice, but the statutory nuisance itself, for example, very widely defined within the Environmental Protection Act. So essentially, if that's an element that groups are looking to use, if they get in touch with the Community Land Team, we can tell you the sort of things that they could cover. What we can tell you is definitely yes, no, that way, and that isn't, because that's what we will take into account when we look at the actual application itself. As I touched on earlier, the relevant regulators are anybody with a statutory power to, in relation to either the harm or the activity causing the harm. So in other words, a regulator that can take action to fix it. Tenancies themselves aren't excluded because they are covered by various other legislative protections for the tenant. And if a community were to buy land which has a tenancy, they would have to take that tenancy on anyway, and all the responsibilities that would come with that. For the purposes of the right to buy, we say exactly what we mean by tenancies or not. Again, that's secondary legislation, and that's quite a detailed list in there. Also details the restriction period, which, as I say, is in general terms from when the application appears in the register to the point where either ministers reject the application, in which case is lifted. If we approve it, it obviously remains, and then when the group conclude the sale, it's then lifted, or the group themselves decide to withdraw, and again it's lifted at that point. Now, that was a very, very fast run through what is quite a complex subject. I'm sure there are a few questions which we'll deal with at the end, but for now, that's my bit done and dusted.
Thanks very much for that, Dave. As you say, a nice quick run through of some quite complicated legislation. So what we're going to do now is hand over to Gemma Campbell from High, who's going to talk to us about how the Scottish Land Fund and the legislation can perhaps interact. If you give me 2 seconds so I can unmute Gemma, otherwise she'll be speaking into the void. There we go.
Hi everyone. Right, I'm going to talk you through a bit about the Scottish Land Fund and how the Part 3 legislation could tie in with applications to the Scottish Land Fund. So, the Land Fund has been set up to support Scottish communities to become more resilient and sustainable through the acquisition, ownership and management of land and land assets. The third iteration of the fund runs from April 2016 to March 2020, so that's us just over halfway through. And the programme headlines this time around are an increase in scale, so we've had a £10 million a year budget, an increase in scope. From April 2016, the Land Fund has been open to urban applications as well as rural, and we do have some limited revenue support available alongside acquisition costs. The outcomes for applications to the Land Fund, we're looking for communities who will achieve more sustainable economic, environmental and social development, have a stronger role in and control over their own development, and own well-managed, financially sustainable land and buildings. We have a two-stage process, and stage one is our feasibility funding pre-acquisition phase. This is open to community organisations with a written governing document who have at least 3 unrelated people in the management committee, and of course if you're requesting funding you're going to need to have a bank account. We can take applications at this point from steering groups who are looking at ideas, and there are different requirements for stage 2 which I'll come to later. So there's a minimum request at stage 1 of £2,500 and a maximum of 30. Our average is sitting around £10,000. And it's always important to point out that there is a lot of demand for this development funding, and match funding will strengthen your application. So what can we fund with stage 1 funding? We look at work that will investigate community aspirations, feasibility, sustainability of ownership, things like technical assistance, surveys, mapping, valuation work, feasibility studies, business plans and consultation on the revenue side. It's work that will enable you to present a stronger application at stage 2 and help you to develop a more sustainable project. It's important to note that for organisations who are looking at using Part 3A for their acquisition, SLF stage 1 funding cannot cover ballot costs or valuation costs. With other routes to ownership, we might be able to cover these things, but in this case, the Scottish Government can provide reimbursement for these costs at a later stage, so it's not something we could look to approve. Now, on stage 2 grants for acquisition. Organisations that are community-led, community-controlled and defined by geographic area can apply, and at stage 2 we do require groups to be eligible. We look for governing documents with a social purpose, open membership, community control and non-profit distributing, and usually the groups we'll see coming forward are companies limited by guarantee or SCAOs or occasionally KICs and BENCOMs. So grants at stage 2 are based upon an independent valuation, not the asking price. And Dave's alluded to that with Part 3 applications, an independent valuer would be appointed and market value is paid. So SLF stage 2 grants are based on market value rather than asking price. Grants are of up to £1 million are available. We have a maximum intervention rate of 95%, but look at an average award of around 80%. Again, because we're looking at 95% grant, match funding is required, and a negotiated discount on the sales price can be included as match funding. Particularly relevant to the Part 3A applications where there are abandoned, neglected or detrimental assets. It's important that groups are looking to acquire an asset, not a liability, particularly where there are buildings involved. If there is a meantime use while development funds are sought, that does strengthen an application. And if there's an immediate use, that's also helpful. In terms of post-acquisition development funding, it's really important to speak to funders early, particularly where if a group is using Part 3A and there are going to be substantial development costs associated with the assets, speak to other funders as soon as you can. If you're coming to SLF stage 2 and you've gone part of the way down the road with your development funders, you've got funding secured, that does again strengthen an application. So just a recap of where we are in terms of SLF 3 at August 2018. We have got around 240 projects in varying stages of development in the pipeline, so it's a busy fund. And to date we've had 75 communities awarded stage 2 funding. 36 of those have been in the Highlands and Islands and 39 of them have been Rest of Scotland projects. So that's just a quick recap for you, and I will hand you back over to Ailey for questions now.
Okay, thank you very much, Gemma. So that was a good run through of the Scottish Land Fund. If everyone could keep their questions coming in, the questions box is nice and busy already. So what I'll do is kick off. We've got a question in. Dave, you've already mentioned the exceptions of land where it's a home, but is there any other exceptions such as industrial estates?
Not really. No, certainly industrial estates aren't excluded in and of themselves. The homes are excluded primarily because that's the last thing one anybody do, have their home blocked from underneath them. But specific types of land, basically it's homes, the QLTR ones I mentioned, Croft land because there's already another right to buy. And that's really probably about it in terms of actual exclusions themselves, you know. Outright exclusions. It may be obviously that the owner comes back and says that there are specific uses which means reject the application, but there's actually not that many types of land which are outright excluded.
Okay. The same person's actually come in with another question. They're saying, how does a community show that its aspiration for land is sustainable?
basically a combination of your business plan and some sort of financial projections. Now, we know obviously that to expect a completely detailed, every T crossed I dotted version of those is unrealistic at this stage, but given that it's a compulsory process, they should be fairly detailed. I know that's a vague term, but how detailed obviously depends on the type of project. If it's a fairly straightforward single building, single use, then fair enough, it's not particularly detailed. More complex, bigger estate with multiple uses, obviously it's going to be more complex in that sense, and it needs to be more detailed as a result. Essentially, what we need to see is we need to be able to look at that application and have evidence that the group have a chance to succeed should they be given the right to buy. And that doesn't, obviously, given the state of these, will include financial projections of some sort. We don't necessarily, in fact, don't need it to make a profit, but we need to be at least convinced that there's a chance that it won't be continually coming back for support over the next several years. A lot of groups, maybe it becomes viable after 2 or 3 years. That's fair enough, but they have to demonstrate where they're going to get the money in the meantime to keep things going, and that touches back on what Chairman was talking about in immediate or a meantime use as being a good thing to show that, okay, part of the asset is abandoned, neglected, we can't use that, but while we're fixing that, we can use this area for something else. So some evidence that there's a chance to succeed.
Okay. I'm starting off with all the questions that are around the legislation, and then I'll be going into the more contextual ones where people are asking about their own communities. If a community has a registration over a piece of land through Part 2 of the legislation, is there anything to stop them seeking to use Part 3 over the same land as long as they can make the case?
No, nothing stops them at all. What happens is the Part 2 registration is suspended, whilst Part 3 one is being considered essentially.
Okie doke, that's quite interesting. We've got a question in from Ross who's saying, is there any way that the legislation could be used for land and buildings which have been declared bona vacantia, if that's how you pronounce it, but have been disclaimed by the Crown?
Yes, if they've been disclaimed by the Crown, at that point they're still ownerless. So there's actually other mechanisms that groups can use, such as vesting orders, etc., which I'm not completely au fait with, but best bet would be to contact Registers of Scotland in that case. There's a couple of different ways groups can take ownership of that land, because if the QLTR have been asked to take possession and then decide not to, then that land is essentially ownerless at that point. There's no heirs to take it on, there's no owners at all. So therefore, there are mechanisms for groups or individuals to then say, right, well, I want to do something with this land, this is what I'm going to do with it, and go through Registers of Scotland to follow a process which will ultimately result in them becoming owners. Because a Part 3A application, we have to serve a prohibition on somebody, and if nobody owns it, there's nobody to serve a prohibition on, and for that matter, there's no need, because nobody can transfer it. So if QLTR decide not to take possession, essentially it's ownerless.
Okay, I think I might have to listen back to that recording to make sure I get it all correct. There's a couple more questions on what type of assets can be included or excluded, such as, are local woods included or excluded?
Include them, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Dave, I don't think quite...
Homes and things like that. There's very few outright exclusions. It's really up to the community group to make a case to why they think this particular land or asset is abandoned, neglected or detrimental. So it's fairly open in that sense.
Okay. Along a similar note, are houses which are long-term empty and in a derelict state covered by the legislation?
They certainly could be. Again, as long as it's not somebody's home, but given that they're long-term derelict, that's unlikely. Really just for the community group to say, why do you think it's abandoned? And that can be quite as simple as there's a range of photos from the last 5 years that shows it's continually deteriorating and it's been like that, or it's sitting on the buildings at risk register, or it's on the local authority's list of vacant and derelict land, or whatever. There's various means, but yeah, I mean, by all means, those would be able to be included as long as they're not somebody's home.
Okay. Again, on the homes front, we've got a question in from Edinburgh on, can a stalled housing development where the developer is in administration be included?
Technically, yes, because there aren't no homes involved, although if it's stalled, it might be phase one is obviously occupied homes, so they would be excluded. But the thing with that to note is that if they are in bankruptcy proceedings or receivership or whatever, there's already a legal process with creditors, etc., which will have to be followed through. So the Part 3 won't step in and interrupt that process. But that doesn't stop the community group from applying. And if that process, it's found that it's stopped for whatever reason, the Part 3 application is still there. So it doesn't stop them putting an application in, but they may find that the legal process of the bankruptcy or whatever is something which is a reason why we would have to reject it, because that process has to be finished first. Okay, you're really getting quizzed on eligibility here. There's one coming in from the Western Isles on eligible croft land. In the situation, if a croft is abandoned and has dilapidated historic buildings and houses, which the community would like to develop, would they apply for each of the individual houses or buildings, or could they apply for the croft they all sit on? The exclusion covers its eligible croft land, so if it's still designated that, it will be excluded. Individual houses, possibly. And I'll apologise now that a lot of the answers to some of the more specific questions might well be possibly, because the legislation is so subjective. It really depends on circumstances surrounding why it's in that state, how long it's been in that state, exactly what designations are on it. Is it actually, if it's eligible croftland, it's excluded, as one of the main exclusions. But for us to know whether it's eligible croftland or not, the Croft Commission would need to let us know that it's on that or whatever. So possibly is the best answer I can give for the individual houses, but eligible croftland is excluded as the Act stays on that one. But again, if the community can say, well, actually it's not, and you've got proof of why it's not, then again, feel free to apply on it. Okay, so that one's likely to be a nice complicated one. On the slightly more technical side, with regards to the ballot that you mentioned, Dave, what is considered an acceptable level of turnout when determining community support? Essentially, we aim at 50% turnout, with 50% of those in favour is the sort of guidelines. The legislation actually states that it's sufficient for ministers to demonstrate community support. It's more or less what the legislation says now, but what we essentially look at is about a 50% turnout, with 50% of those who turned out in favour. And obviously, because it's a ballot of the whole community, it's not a subsection of it, it's not a selected few, it's everybody gets a say. It's a secret postal ballot, so it's a pretty good indication in that respect. Okay. There's a question on Part 3A. Has it been used in an urban context or used for a listed building yet? It hasn't been used for anything yet, to be honest. We've had lots of inquiries about it, and it came into force in June this year, so it's not been in place for very long. The legislation passed a while back, the actual Act came into force in June this year. So we haven't had actually any applications under it yet. Okay. We've got a couple of questions which are a bit more contextual here. So we've got a group who hasn't attempted to make contact with an owner of some abandoned land yet. They know individuals that have tried, but the registered address for the owner is a PO box. Is support available in tracking down an actual address for an owner via the application process? Not through the application process, no, unfortunately. It's one of the things has to take on themselves in terms of identifying it. When I say themselves, obviously there is professional help out there in finding these things, but essentially if the registered address that's on the title for the land is a PO box and they've written several times to that PO box with no response, that could be used as evidence of having tried to buy, because they've written to the only address that is there on the title. That's fine, but we do when we get an application in on owners and groups under Part 2, for example, we have had occasions where groups have said, oh, we're trying to find the owner and can, and we've done our own search we found them. So we do try ourselves to find them, and if it turns out that we have no more luck than a community group in finding the owner other than this PO box, then the fact that it's a PO box with no answer can be used as what we've tried, and they're not contactable.
Okay. We've got another contextual one here. This is an area which has a pier which is privately owned, and the local council closed it as it was unsafe 5 or 6 years ago. The community see that as detrimental to themselves and their local businesses. The council are now willing to allow the pier to be opened as the repairs have been carried out. However, the private owner does not want to open the pier as it protects a boat he has berthed alongside. Is there any opportunity to get the pier open as a right of way, or would they have to go through as a compulsory purchase order under the legislation?
Both rights of way and compulsory purchase orders are for a local authority to deal with, so this part of the Act isn't really applicable. Given the fact that repairs have been done, it sounds like it would no longer be abandoned or neglected either, so the detrimental part would be the only route you could have. Comes from Part 3, but they'd have to say why do you think it's causing harm to the environmental well-being of the community, and it's the current use or management or lack of use or management that they would have to try and say is causing that harm. And obviously things like getting the relevant regulator to try and fix that, so that could be the local authority in this case to say, well, can they force them to open that under the right of way or compulsory purchase or whatever. So immediate action, there's nothing this Act can do to that under things like rights of way or compulsory purchase orders. So the best bet for that would probably contact the local authority in the first instance and see what they say, because actually you haven't got that relevant regulator. But again, have been trying to contact the owner to buy the pier off them, but they've tried that as well. If they want to use Part 3 of that.
Okay, I'm going to give Dave a slight break and send one Gemma's direction. Gemma, one of the people is asking you to expand on the part of your talk about an asset, not a liability. So there's some urban land that this person's aware of would have a significant conservation deficit, i.e. the end value will be lower than the repair and conversion costs. Would the Scottish Land Fund be able to assist those types of properties?
Oh, that's another tricky one. I think it would come down to the case that was presented, but when we say an asset and not a liability, it's looking at the asset as an ongoing concern. Is it something that could be sustainable on an ongoing basis? What would it cost to manage or run, and in the business plan that would be presented with the case, is it shown that that is something that would be viable for the long term?
Okay, thanks Gemma. Dave, it's straight back to you. There's lots of questions coming in, which is great. Could an existing owner be forced to demolish an existing derelict asset?
No, not under this Act. Clarify that a little bit. This Act is only about the community taking on ownership. Of course, once they get ownership, if they get ownership through the Act, they can then demolish that and do what they wish, rebuild if that was part of their plan, but it can't force the owner to do so, no.
Okay, we've got another couple of questions on the ballot. Firstly, is there an age restriction?
Basically, the Act defines your community as, you define your geographic boundaries by the likes of postcodes or settlements, localities, but people within that community boundary have to be eligible to vote in a local election. So essentially they have to be on the register and they have to be 16 or over. Essentially, that's the restrictions, or people who count as members of the community.
Okay, talking of being a member of that community, if a community group covers a number of villages, but the building is in one village, would the ballot have to cover all the village or just the village affected?
If the community group have defined themselves as covering all of the villages, then the ballot is on the community, not a subsection of the community. However, groups can essentially form a smaller group who can apply to us, which maybe covers one village. So you've essentially got two different community groups. The main one which covers, I'm going to say day-to-day stuff around all the villages in the community area, but whatever that community group normally does as part of their remit, their actions. It's nothing wrong with setting up a distinct and specific group to deal with a right to buy. And if that group defines themselves as that single village, that's fine. Obviously they then have to get themselves compliant and then they have to do the ballot and all the rest of it, not the wider group. It really depends on which one's easiest for them.
Okie doke. Now, unless more questions come in, this is the last question that's sitting on my screen. And it's a fairly long one. It's a deterrent to a compulsory purchase application appears to be that the community could spend a lot of money in their attempt, and then the owner decides to show willingness or ability to resolve the problem. Is there any form of reimbursement which can be claimed by a community group which finds itself in that position?
Unfortunately, no, under the Act. The one thing to note though, and again, this is one of the things that we've tested with the first few cases in the Act, is that the condition of the land is taken to be that condition when the application is received. So even if an application is received and the owner then takes that 6-month period while we're getting used backwards and forwards and considering to do something, it's the condition of land when the application is received that we will take into account. Now, if a group contact the owner about buying it, obviously ahead of making the application, because that's what they must do, and then the owner decides to fix the issue before the application comes in, then as I was saying earlier, that brings the land back into productive use. So that's the main aim of this part. If the community have taken on costs leading up to that point, then unfortunately from the Scottish Government anyway, there's no recourse to reimbursement for those costs at that point.
Okay, we've had another question sneak in, and it's actually for both Dave and Gemma, so we'll go to Dave first and then to Gemma. Geographical location is difficult within an urban context with very limited resident population, i.e. a city centre location for where very few people live. How would you suggest using Part 3A or the land fund for those types of land?
Well, when a community group defines themselves geographically, essentially they're saying this is where the members of our community are from. That does not have to be the same as the area of land which they wish to purchase. It must have some sort of a connection with that land in some way, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same. So that city centre one, for example, if there are no members of the community actually live in that city centre, and the community are defined as the area next to it, which does have them in it, that's fine. The one thing to be aware of though is if there are residents in that city centre area, you really should include them in the ballot as part of the community. Give them a say in what happens directly on their doorstep. But no, it doesn't have to be one and the same, but there has to be some sort of a connection between the two.
Yeah, from an SLF perspective, I would agree with what Dave said there. The community should be able to demonstrate a connection to the asset that they're looking to acquire, and they should be able to demonstrate why their community has a need to purchase that asset and what benefit it will bring to the community.
Okay, I hope that answers everyone's questions. Now is your time to get any last minute questions in. In the meantime, I'll draw your attention to your screen. If you do want to ask any questions of the Scottish Land Fund or of the community land team at Scottish Government, the contact details are on the screen. Please do note them down. They're very friendly people. And Community Land Week, and again, is from the 11th till the 19th of August, and there's some really exciting events happening all across Scotland, so I really would encourage you to check that out on the Community Land Scotland website. And as no more questions have come in, all that is left to say is to say thank you to Dave and Gemma for presenting today. This presentation has been recorded, so once I've done some editing, it will be sent out to everyone who has attended and registered to have a listen back, and the presentations will be available to download at the same time. I just got a flurry of questions asking for the presentation to be sent out, so yes, I can reassure you that they will be available to download. And other than that, thank you very much, and hope everyone has a lovely morning.
Okay, thank you very much.